Hello, saints and scholars, let's get ready to walk like an Egyptian. As you know from reading the Torah, the Egyptians have a massive impact on kind of the whole narrative and directional flow of the Old Testament. And well, they might. They were an absolutely massive empire that existed in the world at this time. The Egyptian Empire spanned a ridiculous 3,000 years history, possibly the longest running empire in the entire world, except for maybe China. Scholars tend to divide Egyptian history into 5 sections. The early dynastic period is when the two kingdoms that made up what we now call Egypt come together into one united monarchy. This is the season when the pyramids start to get built. Now, one of the most interesting events that takes place in Egyptian history that relates to biblical history is the invasion of the Hyksos. The Hyksos were an Asiatic people that enter into Egypt possibly as immigrants, refugees, for whatever reason we're not quite sure. But the Hyksos took with them the Edenic blessing and started to go forth and multiply. Really quickly, within a few generations, the Hyksos were a mighty force throughout Egypt. So much so, they actually kind of get stronger and stronger, form their own military, and briefly take over Egypt. For about 150 years, the Egyptians are second-class citizens in their own country, with the Hyksos ruling over Egypt. Yet a great military leader named Ahmose unifies the Egyptian people, takes on the Hyksos, and kicks them out of the land of Egypt. So powerful was Ahmose, he then goes on to become pharaoh of the new kingdom. Then Egypt enters into a season where they become colonies or vassals of other countries. Persians, Greeks, and Romans all take over the Egyptian kingdom. The last pharaoh of Egypt is our famous girl Cleopatra. The pharaoh dynasty was ended by Caesar Augustus, who despised Cleopatra and crushed her entire kingdom. This would be the same Caesar Augustus who would have been Caesar around the time of the birth of Christ. Let's try and put the scale of the Egyptian kingdom into perspective. You sitting here in 2023 are closer in time to Cleopatra than Cleopatra was to the building of the pyramids. Egypt lasted a seriously long time. Let's talk about the Egyptian religion. At this point, I'm sure you've seen those wonderful, colorful images of the incredible pantheon of Egyptian gods. Frog heads and cow heads and blue skins and giving birth to sun and moon all over the place. It was a wacky world of mythological divinity. So much so that even today, we still love reading about the Egyptian mythos. As should be duly noted, central to Egyptian existence and life was the Nile River that ran through the country. As Egypt itself never rained, they were dependent upon the ebbing and flowing of the Nile River to water their crops and keep the whole country hydrated. So much so that there were gods that were there to watch over the Nile that the Egyptian people constantly sacrificed to in order to placate any problems that may be in society. So much so that this was almost a religious idea. When the soil was well nourished with Egyptian water, it turned this thick black, which the Egyptian people associated with life. Yep, when the waters of the Nile pulled back and the soil was dehydrated, it turned red, which the Egyptians associated with death. This likely connects with the Moses story of turning the Nile the color of blood. As is pretty clear about the Egyptians, they were really obsessed with death. In fact, all of the great symbols of ancient Egypt are all associated with death. Pyramids were tombs. Mummies were dead people. Tutankhamun's mask was a death mask. The Egyptians kind of believed that the afterlife was pretty similar to the life they live now, and you were quite able to take all of your good stuff with you. This is why wealthy Egyptians, particularly pharaohs, would surround themselves with the beautiful pieces of furniture that they owned in this life. The idea is they wanted their bodies to be perfectly preserved along with all of their material possessions so that they could enjoy them in the next life. Yet there was a moral dimension to the afterlife. Upon death, Egyptians would go to the goddess Ma'at, where she would weigh one's heart on a scale with a feather. And if your heart was lighter than the feather, it meant you were a good person and worthy to enter into the land of the dead. The Egyptian obsession with death could be contrasted with the Old Testament revulsion at death. Death is always quite a negative thing in the Old Testament. Even touching dead bodies or going in graveyards made one unclean, which we could very much contrast with the Egyptians, who were constantly wanting to be associated with the dead. Let's look at possible Bible connections with Egyptian history. If we look back at our good friend the Hyksos, we may see parallels between the Hyksos and the Exodus story. In fact, some people have even believed that the Exodus was a myth that develops out of the Hyksos invasion, though this is probably quite overstated. It's quite likely that the Hyksos themselves came from the Canaan region. Some historians have suggested that Joseph comes to power in Egypt during the reign of the Hyksos. The Egyptians were notoriously racist and incredibly ethnocentric. The idea of putting an immigrant in a position of such incredible power would generally be contrary to Egyptian practice. But if the pharaoh at the time was Hyksos, who themselves came from Canaan, they may be more inclined to put someone that comes from the same region into a position of power. But during this time, the Hyksos fell from power and the Egyptian pharaohs come back to rule. Given this historical foresight, an Egyptian pharaoh might look at the Hebrew people continuing to multiply and gain favor in the land and relate it to what had recently happened with the Hyksos. This may explain why the Egyptians so ruthlessly slaughtered the Hebrews who were living in their land. They saw it almost as a foreshadowing of another Hyksos event. We also see several events within the Old Testament that appear to be directly challenging Egyptian gods. The golden calf that is worshipped by the Israelites was likely the Egyptian god Apis. Apis was usually represented as a golden bull. Another possible connection would be the snake in the Garden of Eden could be the god Apep. Every day the sun god Ra would drive his chariot across the sky, illuminating the world for everyone in it. Yet when he went underneath the globe, he would have been attacked by the snake god Apet, who tried to repress him from bringing out the sun. And this god Ra had to actually stab the god Apet and crush his head so that he could safely bring the sun around the world again for another day. This parallel between the snake trying to stop humanity moving forward or maybe having a new day could have biblical parallelisms. Finally, many have noted that the plagues wrought upon the Egyptians seem to be a direct challenge to a member of the Egyptian pantheon of gods. For example, the Nile turning to blood could be a direct attack on Hapi, the god of the Nile. Pestilence among the cattle could be a direct challenge to the bull god Apis. The days of darkness could be attacking the sun god Ra. Even the death of the firstborn could be attacking Pharaoh, who himself was considered a god. While it is unlikely that any Egyptian theology influenced the development of Jewish theology, in all likelihood, many of the experiences that the Hebrews were having at the time were no doubt influenced by Egyptian theology and particularly Egyptian history. The Hebrews wanted to associate themselves as something different and distinct from the world around them. And as Egypt was the primary example of world and culture, a lot of what they referenced and were avoiding seemed to be directed at Egyptian practices. Looking at the practices and history of the Egypt, we could see the Hebrews trying to rise above examples in the world to manifest God all the brighter.